Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. As you said, it is a very interdisciplinary challenge to clean up contaminated sites, and so I'm happy to see everybody here. And as you said, I'm a remedial project manager, and so that means that I oversee and I regulate the work that is being conducted by performing parties, those parties that have some responsibility to take part in site cleanup. I'm part of a team working at EPA on the Portland Harbor Superfund Site. There are 6 remedial project managers, and I'm one of them, a team lead, a community involvement coordinator, and multiple attorneys. So it's a pretty big team just on the EPA side, and there are a lot of folks beyond that involved as well that we'll talk about in a little bit here. I'll also just mention that I work on a couple of sites in Alaska. One is a former mine site on the Prince of Wales Island, about a 45-minute plane ride from Ketchikan, and also a former pulp mill in Ketchikan in southeast of Alaska. And now's probably a good time to say I love my job. It's a great mix of science and interacting with people. It's a mix of being outside and engaging in the real world, and also being behind the computer analyzing data, which is also a favorite pastime of mine. And of course, there's attending meetings. That's ever present. And there's always something new I'm learning. So it really has been a great profession, and I encourage you to look into it. And so largely this presentation is about the Portland Harbor Superfund Site, which I'll go over a bit in the coming slides, and I'll mostly be focusing on how the design is transitioning into remedial action, but I'll provide some background first, and I'll make sure to leave some time for questions and answers too. So in terms of background, I'll just provide a quick primer on Superfund. Congress established the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, CERCLA, also called Superfund, in 1980, and that allows EPA to clean up contaminated sites. Oh, I'm sorry, this is probably showing up on the screen. I'll move that. And so the establishment of CERCLA was in response to discovery of toxic waste dumps such as Love Canal in Niagara Falls, New York, and Valley of the Drums in Kentucky in the 1970s. And that received national attention when the public learned about the risks to human health and the environment posed by these contaminated sites. And there are 4 priority goals of the Superfund program. They are to protect human health and the environment by cleaning up contaminated sites, making responsible parties pay for that cleanup work, involve communities in the Superfund process, and return Superfund sites to productive use. So moving on to our local Superfund site here, the Portland Harbor. The site is about 10 miles of river. That's from the Broadway Bridge here, if you can see my cursor, at the northern portion of downtown, to about a mile north of Sovey Island. So here's Sovey Island, it's about a mile north of that. And here's the Multnomah Channel here. So it's a good amount of river here. And it does include the Swan Island Basin right here. I'm also showing 2 other reaches upstream of the Portland Harbor Superfund site. The downtown reach that picks up on the southern portion of the site right here and extends to about the Selwood Bridge, and then the upriver reach, and that extends from the Selwood Bridge to about the Willamette Falls in Oregon City. And the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality is the lead agency for any contamination in those areas. And they've in fact overseen several remedial actions already in those areas. The harbor has long been a place of multiple uses, from industry and shipping to providing ecological habitat, including being a migratory corridor for salmon, and a place of recreation and fishing, which continues today. And it's the historical industrial uses of the Portland Harbor that have led to the majority of the contamination that we're looking to clean up. So just a little bit more detail on the industrial uses of one of the Portland Harbor areas. I'm showing here some historical and more current aerials of the Willamette Cove. It's located between the St. John's Bridge and the Railroad Bridge on the east side of the river. If you ever take the Amtrak up to Washington, you'll cross the river, and on the left-hand side is the Willamette Cove. From the 1900s to the 1970s, the site was used extensively for heavy industrial activity, including a lumber mill, barrel construction, and dry dock activities. And with significant overwater activity, you can see all of the ships there and the lumber stacking up. And this is just one example of industrial use. There were many more industrial uses throughout the 10 miles of the harbor, such as ship dismantling, storage of bulk fuels, manufactured gas production, chemical manufacturing, and steel mills. So I think, looking at the historical photos and aerials is not only fascinating, but you can really learn a lot about where you might expect contamination to be and where to start looking for it. So we do a lot of that. As a result of this extensive and varied and long industrial use of the river and nearshore areas, there's a long list of contaminants that are of concern here. 64 chemicals or groups of chemicals have been identified as causing unacceptable risk to human health and the environment. The contaminants that are most widespread and that are driving the cleanup activities are listed here. And so I'm looking here at the major contaminants: polychlorinated biphenyls, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, the DDX pesticide compounds, and dioxins and furans. And what these chemicals have in common is that they are largely hydrophobic, meaning they are typically found absorbed in sediment rather than dissolved in water. But it also means that they tend to accumulate in animal tissue. So as these contaminants are ingested up the food chain, concentrations increase, which is why these chemicals can have seemingly low concentrations in the environment, in the river, but still can end up causing unacceptable conditions for people eating the fish from the river. And the highest risk at the Portland Harbor is to people eating fish that are residents in the river, such as carp, bass, and catfish. And there's also unacceptable risk to benthic invertebrates, fish and birds and mammals that are exposed to the contamination in Portland Harbor. So as we were saying, that the highest risk is to people eating the fish that are residents in the river. Young children, nursing infants, and babies in the womb are the most sensitive populations to the effects of these chemicals. So they are put at greatest risk if their mother eats fish from the river and then breastfeeds them. This slide shows the Oregon Health Authority recommendation for eating or not eating resident fish and shellfish from the river at this time. And part of the point of the cleanup is to allow for folks to be able to consume more of these fish from the river in the future. There are also unacceptable risks to fish and wildlife. Benthic invertebrates in the sediment can be adversely impacted by chemicals in the river bottom. Fish are exposed to chemicals both directly and through the food chain, and then birds and mammals that feed on lower trophic organisms may also bioaccumulate chemicals just as people do. And that brings us to the goals of the Portland Harbor Superfund Site cleanup objectives, and those are called remedial action objectives. And because we have so many chemicals contaminating the river and so many pathways by which people and fish and wildlife can be exposed and adversely impacted by the contaminants, we have a lot of them addressing exposure to sediment, biota. So by biota, we mean contaminants accumulated in tissue, surface water, and groundwater for both human health and ecological receptors. And we're also looking at riverbanks to ensure that if they are contaminated, they don't erode and continue to contribute to contamination in the river. So where are we in the process of the cleanup? In 2000, We established that there is contamination in the harbor and it's significant, large, and complex enough to be listed as a Superfund site. And then from 2000 to 2010, a lot of samples and of many different types of media, sediment, surface water, fish tissue, were collected and analyzed. And risks to human health and the environment were assessed and decided that a cleanup was necessary to protect human health and the environment. In 2011, a feasibility study was conducted to decide how best to clean up the contamination. And then in 2015, EPA issued a proposed plan to describe how the cleanup should occur. And this plan was made available for public comment and tribes were consulted. And then EPA issued the final cleanup plan, which is called the Record of Decision, in early 2017. And today we are in the remedial design portion of the process, which precedes the remedial action. I'll focus on these next two elements in the rest of the presentation, the remedial design and the remedial action. This is a map from the ROD that shows the areas that are slated for active remedies, given the information that we had at the time the ROD was written in 2017. The selected technologies identified in the ROD include dredging, and those are those areas that are shown in yellow. It might be a little bit hard to see, but dredging basically is the removal of sediment and disposal of off-site at a landfill. Capping areas are shown in green, and that involves placing materials such as clean sediment. Sometimes there are amendments like activated carbon, and that material is placed over the contamination to contain it both physically and chemically to isolate it. The red portions are a combination of both dredging and capping, because some of the contamination goes so deep that it's possible we can't remove it all, and so it would need to be partially removed and then capped. And then the majority of the site is shown in sort of this brown tan color. The river is anticipated to recover naturally to some degree, such as when cleaner sediment comes from upstream and then settles over contaminated sediment. This process is monitored through sampling and analysis over time. And then in blue, there's some portion of the Swan Island Basin that is slated for enhanced natural recovery. And that's because, it doesn't receive the same benefit of cleaner sediments transporting downstream and settling over contaminated material, because it just doesn't have that upstream aspect. And so what we mean by enhanced natural recovery is that there's usually a layer of sand that's placed to jumpstart the natural recovery process. So that's what's slated there. So moving on to remedial design, which is that part of the process that we are in right now. It's in my mind, one of the exciting parts where we get to really decide how to get the job done. It's where we go from the conceptual understanding of the remedy that's identified in the ROD, what we were just looking at, that figure that shows, well, generally speaking, we're thinking there would be some dredging and capping and that sort of thing, to, where we get detailed construction drawings that can be implemented. Remedial design requires a significant amount of data gathering, such as chemical and geotechnical sampling and engineering work. And each design has to balance a lot of considerations, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. But in general, these considerations include constructability, the protectiveness and resiliency of the remedial action. However, some of these design considerations compete against each other. For example, needing to stabilize features such as riverbanks and caps, and sometimes requiring hardening features, while at the same time limiting hardening to avoid habitat degradation. So there's often a balancing act here. So given the significant undertaking of designing remedial actions for 10 miles of river, the site was divvied up into 18 different project areas, and that's what I'm showing here in the different polygons. Each of these polygons is led in design by a different performing party and design team. So we have a lot of folks involved. And we also call these areas project areas. I might refer to them that way as well. They start at the Broadway Bridge, as I mentioned earlier, and extend to the north tip of Zoe's Island, or beyond, slightly beyond that. And the orange call-outs show areas where EPA is taking the lead in conducting at least the initial design work. And then the other areas is where we have performing parties, these areas shown in red, where we have performing parties that are signed up to do the design work. And here are the major remedial design components, and each of these project areas is undergoing this. The remedial design investigation is when the majority of the data are collected that are needed for design, and to refine the area requiring remedial action and to select the appropriate technology. So that would be dredging or capping, and what kind of cap if a cap is selected. After those data are generated and pre-design, the design progresses in an iterative way with refinements in each step until at the end, a set of construction drawings and specifications are finalized. So right now, a lot of the project areas are conducting the first phase of remedial design sampling, and so are focused on collecting samples of the sediment in both the surface and subsurface. In a limited number of circumstances, sediment samples can involve accessing the sample locations from land and collection without significant equipment, but more often than not, vessels are used and equipment that is too heavy for people to handle are deployed using winches. And so surface grab samplers and fiber core samplers are most commonly being used in Portland Harbor. The first picture on the left shows the surface grab sampler. It's typically deployed with a winch. The jaws of the sampler lower into the sediment about a foot, and then the jaws close and the sediment is brought back to the surface. And the goal here is to collect as intact a sample of the surface sediment as possible so that it represents the sediment as it is found in the environment. And that is sometimes a trickier thing to do than you might think. The picture in the lower left over here shows a good example of an intact sample where the sediment probably looks very much like it does on the river bottom. And the next picture here shows the vibrocore sampler. This is a mechanism attached at the top to the core tube that vibrates, and then it's driven into the sediment and displaces the sediment just a few millimeters to reduce the friction and allows the core tube to penetrate to our desired depth, usually in the range of 10, 15, 20 feet below the mud line. Here, again, the goal is to try to extrude a core from the subsurface that is as intact as possible so that what we see in the core reflects what is actually in the river. And so the three pictures on the right here show how the retrieved core is brought to a facility on land to be processed. The core tube is cut in half so the geologist can describe the type of sediment, and samples from the desired depths can be collected. Again, this is often a pretty involved process in 30 to 50 feet of water. Sometimes there are obstructions such as debris or vessels that we need to work around. And there's necessarily a lot of attention paid to the safety of the samplers in these circumstances. So in terms of how much time this takes, a good rule of thumb is that if everything goes smoothly and the sampling equipment doesn't encounter debris or other issues requiring a redo, about 4 of the 10-foot vibropores can be collected in one day. So the sampling can take a while, and a lot of these phase 1 efforts are running on the order of weeks to months, just to give you an idea of how much work is involved here. the sediment is collected and processed. The sediment is placed in appropriate containers that are specially cleaned to limit contamination by the jars. You know, we're looking at very, very low concentrations in the parts per trillion sometimes. So the samples have to be very clean, or the sample jars have to be very clean. The samples are held at specific temperatures to limit any changes in chemical composition while the samples are being held and transported to the library. And then takes about a month, sometimes a bit more, to get the results from the laboratory. And so given the significant level of effort involved in obtaining these samples, the expense and the significance of the decisions too that are being made about these data, a large part of the program involves quality assurance and quality control of those samples. You know, samples are collected in the field to evaluate whether any errors were introduced into the program through field methods. And likewise, the laboratory conducts additional analyses to evaluate the same. An example of a quality control sample is a field duplicate. So for example, a field duplicate is collected at the same place and time as the primary sample, and then we can compare the concentrations of that the laboratory reports for the primary and duplicate and see what the precision of the result is. Sometimes we'll even send a field duplicate to a different laboratory to evaluate precision between laboratories. Then each and every data point goes through a quality review and check. And by every data point, I mean every chemical and every sample, which is typically hundreds of data points for a typical design sampling event. And so that takes some time as well, often a couple of months. But it's important, right? It's these are the data that we're using to make our decisions. And this type of work is being conducted throughout the harbor. If you were out near the river this summer, you probably saw one or more vessels doing this type of work. And you'll see more of that again this spring, summer, and fall. The top figure here is an example of a portion of a project area. So kind of zoomed in near river, it's about River Mile 9 on the west side of the river. And it shows the sediment samples here that have been historically collected before we had our decision document, our record of decision. And this is a portion of the Portland Harbor site that represents about a half mile. So recall that there are 10 miles of river. So this is just a half mile of it. The figure below shows the additional locations that were sampled as part of the pre-design investigation. These samples are collected at 150-foot centers, resulting in a lot of sampling. And we're talking about surface samples and cores. Investigations like this are going on throughout the river. So you know, my fellow RPMs and I were estimating the other day that there were probably over 10,000 samples that were collected in the last year at the Portland Harbor Superfund Site. It's quite an undertaking. And this is just one example of the type of samples we're collecting. There are also additional data collections underway, such as bathymetric analysis, stormwater sampling, riverbank erodibility assessments, geotechnical samples are being collected, and all of these data are being collected now to inform the remedial design. Each project area in Portland Harbor has many elements to consider to select the appropriate remedial technology and develop the optimal construction approach. And each project area can be different in terms of how these considerations interplay and drive decisions. And so I'll go through each of these considerations in a bit more detail in the next slides. One of the first considerations is whether any of the forthcoming remedial actions have the potential to be recontaminated. So that's a situation where you go out, you clean up the riverbed, and then you come back and you realize that you know, there was an ongoing source, perhaps from the uplands, from stormwater, from the bank, from upriver, something along that line that has been ongoing and has recontaminated the site. And that is, of course, an unfortunate situation. And so That is the first thing that most folks are looking at, so that if any of these recontamination sources are found, they can be dealt with appropriately before the remedial action is actually implemented. Constructability, a very important consideration is current and future land use. There are many land uses throughout the site. It's a working harbor with significant shipping traffic and industrial uses, in addition to providing public access and recreation opportunities and ecological habitat. We've got it all. The designs are considering anticipated future land use as well. For example, no longer making use of an existing dock, or perhaps planning for a dock. For example, a river ferry is evaluating whether they want to apply to put a landing at Cathedral Park. So that would be something we would need to accommodate for in our remedial design. Similarly, existing structures are being evaluated. Can or should they be removed to ensure the most effective remedial design? Or are the structures permanent, and do they have to be accommodated in the design? Existing geology and stability, is the current condition stable? For example, the riverbanks, are they erosive? If so, the riverbanks may need to be stabilized. River conditions. There are many conditions in the river, both natural and generated by people, that are considered during design. A flood impact evaluation is required to verify that there will be no net rise in the floodway caused by the remedy. And the flood rise has to consider a 500-year flood of elevation. Otherwise, the construction must go through a waiver process. And that's something that FEMA manages. The remedial action also needs to be designed to withstand the forces of a 100-year flood event. The picture here is the 1996 flood, showing pedestrians that are gathered on a steel bridge to view the rising Willamette River. It was taken in February of that year of 1996. So we can have some unusual conditions, of course, in the Willamette River. And the remedial actions also need to withstand the forces of wind and vessel-generated waves and propeller scours, such as from jet boats and tugs, pictured here. A lot of the contamination is close to shore and in more shallow areas where some of the propeller wash is going to have a more significant effect on the sediment. And these forces are directly tied to the current and future land use, as I mentioned earlier. If land use changes from an area where propeller wash wasn't expected to one that is in the future, that also has to be accommodated in the design. Seismic resiliency. The designs will evaluate remedy performance for the worst earthquake that is likely to occur within the next 475 years. And I'll just say, this is not my area of expertise. I am definitely relying on the experts for this evaluation. But it's my understanding that this is the same level of earthquake that wharves and piers are typically evaluated for. If the evaluation shows that this level of earthquake would be likely to expose contaminated sediment, EPA would require an evaluation of engineering fixes. And if those fixes aren't feasible, designs will incorporate post-earthquake assessments and repairs in their long-term operations and maintenance plans. So while we understand that we need to design for rare and significant earthquakes, it's not possible to design for every possible scenario. So we do account for potential fixes in the aftermath of such a situation. Climate change resiliency. Changes in hydrology of the river, both seasonal patterns of river flow and peak storm event flows, as well as sea level rise, are expected. And will likely have higher winter flows and lower summer flows, while the higher sea level will increase the backwater effect. Vulnerable remedy components include erosion protection measures used in caps and various engineering measures used for shoreline stabilization. Designs are expected to consider the latest climate change projections and emission scenarios available at the time of design. And the recommended planning horizon is the year 2100 to maximize the design life given the climate change scenarios and projections currently available. We typically look at a 100-year horizon when we're looking at designs. We have to accommodate for habitat. Habitat evaluation will be included in the project area specific biological assessment, and that determines whether remedial actions themselves may adversely affect listed species and essential fish habitat. There will be a characterization of baseline conditions of the existing habitat, and then an assessment of the potential project impacts that the remedy may have on the species and their habitat. And then in addition, the assessment will describe the best management practices and conservation measures to avoid or minimize any of those negative impacts. And in addition, a Clean Water Act evaluation will be conducted to evaluate the long and short-term impacts from the remedial action. So the construction work itself, and identify any practices to minimize those adverse effects and any need for mitigation for the construction. So we have two elements here. We have the evaluation associated with the construction activity itself, and then also any long-term impacts associated with the remedy that had been constructed, for example, a hardening of a surface. Green remediation is something that the EPA requires be evaluated. Renewable energy and energy conservation and efficiency approaches, cleaner fuels, water conservation, reuse or recycling of materials. We do expect that rail be used as opposed to truck transport to the extent practicable. Barging materials in and out may also be a possibility. And finally, community impacts. I've listed some examples of how we expect to limit impacts to the community during our remedial action. The remedial action is expected to take many years, in the neighborhood of 10 years. And so, carefully thinking about how communities near the Portland Harbor Superfund Site will be impacted by that will be important, and it'll be important to monitor those activities and continually improve our approach on that front. And finally, there are a couple items that are underway that relate to the whole site. As part of these remedies, we look at institutional controls, and that's EPA's term for activity and use limitations. So that's things like the fish advisories or zoning restrictions to reduce people's exposure to contamination. And all of that has to be documented. And it's called the Programmatic Institutional Control Implementation and Assurance Plan, ICIAP. We have a lot of acronyms. I'm trying to avoid them. And then the information management plan that refers to the process of storing and displaying environmental data and institutional controls for the site. The city of Portland and the state of Oregon are working on both of these plans, and these are important documents for the public and will be accessible throughout the life of the project and beyond, so that the public can access real-time information about the Portland Harbor Superfund Site. So remedial action. As I said, the site was listed in 2000. There was a lot of data collection, a lot of data analysis. A decision document was issued, and now we are refining how we're actually going to implement that remedial action. And we'll have gone through this extensive process that I just described, or scratched the surface of. We'll be developing the best possible designs to account for and also balance a wide range of factors. As I mentioned, we have 18 separate designs in the 18 project areas developed by different designers. We have 10 miles of river, and we need to be to the point where we can mobilize barges and cranes and start construction. So I'll just mention some things that we need to be thinking about so that we can segue smoothly into a remedial action in a timely fashion. I went through some of these challenges. You know, there are some really significant ones. Shared resources. Are there enough barges? What about the cap material? Is there enough of it? How will we import it? How do we avoid all the different remedial actions getting in each other's way and competing for resources? And how do we sequence things? You know, not all of these construction projects will occur at exactly the same time. As one construction is occurring, is there a potential that another area would be recontaminated? Possibly. So these are all things that we need to be really thoughtful about as we plan for implementation. Before we initiate any construction, we'll need to be thinking about the necessary infrastructure and whether it is already available or if it needs to be developed or constructed. A significant element of infrastructure that could be extremely useful is a nearby transload facility. A transload facility is a permitted and constructed to facilitate movement of sediment from a dredge barge to land, and then either to truck or rail, preferably rail, as we said, to get it to the landfill. Having one or more transload facilities in the right locations in the Portland Harbor could significantly reduce time. It could minimize bottlenecks, reduce cost and the carbon footprint of transporting dredge materials. And ideally, there would be space for staging of dredged material and for dewatering. I think we've seen at other sites that this can be really an issue if and a real bottleneck in the remedial actions. And siting a transload facility is a significant effort and requires consideration of a lot of different elements, such as access to the water and at the same time access to rail, an area that is large enough and suitable for offloading, stockpiling and handling sediment from multiple project areas. You know, all of this, they're all reliant on one another, and planning in advance how to move the dredged material from the river bottom to the landfill can make a big difference in the success of the work. Coordinating the remedial action efforts. The sequencing, like I mentioned earlier, we definitely want to sequence the construction work to limit any potential recontamination of areas that are already remedied. Dredging should be completed before capping clean material, and there could be other drivers, such as you know, which areas are completed in design. Not all of the designs are on the same exact schedule. Equipment, resources, and optimization. Like I said, there may be limits on availability of barges or other equipment. Personnel that are highly skilled in specialized construction. We're already seeing actually that the contractor availability is limited for those folks who do the sampling work. We don't want to create a situation where resource competition gets in the way of effectively completing the work. And further construction will need to be structured so that the public still has accessibility to the river and that all points of access are not blocked at the same time. So lots of things to consider. And finally, all of this will be highly monitored. We'll be monitoring the impacts to the community, such as noise and light and those types of things. Will be evaluating the impacts to water quality, and we'll be able to use this information to improve our approach over the years that it takes to implement this design. Important to collect as much information as possible so that we can learn real time what works and what can use improvement. So I have a few more slides, but my final thoughts on the actual remedial design to remedial action segue is that each design has to balance many complex considerations. And many of those considerations are very specific to each project area. Some have oversteepened banks, others don't. You know, each area has its own challenges. But design is underway and we are making progress. It has been a long time coming, and we feel like we are making progress, and we are proactively looking towards a seamless transition to remedial action. And I just want to mention on these next couple of slides that you know, the level of involvement that's at play at the Portland Harbor Superfund Site. In addition to the EPA, we have the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. They're the lead on source control on limiting any recontamination potential. And they also support the EPA for the in-water aspect. We have a technical coordinating team that we work with. That's all of these folks here, tribes and federal and state partners. They provide technical input into all of the work that is being done at the Portland Harbor Superfund Site and the community as well. There are lots of different ways to get involved as a community member. They're all, you can check them out on the website. You can join the listserv. We have quarterly Portland Harbor collaborative meetings where we present a variety of information. And the next one is on March 9th. You'll find that information on our website. And on our website are all the remedial project managers and our community involvement coordinators. So if there's ever a question, that's where our contact information is on the website for a reason. The public is absolutely welcome to reach out to us and ask us questions. And finally, I thought I would put a page in here about the opportunities for employment. I was just on the site yesterday. It looks like there's a specific webpage for students who are looking for an entree to federal work. And that is the end of my presentation. And I think we have some time here for questions.